In Chapter 9, we'll talk about Congress. We'll start by talking about a political paradox where Americans have strong disapproval toward Congress, yet strong support for their individual representatives. So one reason for that contradiction is that representatives work specifically for constituents and provide service to them, as well as making laws for the nation as a whole. The bicameralism of Congress refers to its two separate houses, the House and the Senate. And Congress is expected to handle at least 6 major functions. Most importantly, lawmaking and representation, as well as constituent service, oversight, public education, and conflict resolution. The main function of Congress is lawmaking, the decisions on legally binding rules that govern all Americans. Congress sets broad national policies by building coalitions through debate, compromise, and log rolling, which is really agreeing in advance to support one another's bills, often those not yet reviewed by the executive branch, which are called earmarks. Members of Congress take part in representation, promoting both their constituents' narrower views and the nation's larger interests, which can lead to conflict. They may play several roles. One, the instructed delegate. In that role, legislators reflect the views of the constituents who elected them, regardless of their own personal beliefs. The trustee view, legislators rely on their conscience and consider the broader needs of the whole society rather than the narrow interests at home. And most often, legislators combine those two roles into a more practical mix called the Politico style. Members of Congress assist private citizens in dealing with their individual problems and questions regarding government actions, called casework. They often act as ombudsmen who investigate and resolve complaints of their constituents against the government. Congress is also responsible for oversight, follow up on laws to ensure that they are being administered and enforced by the executive branch as intended. And Congress often eases up on any inquiries when the president is from their party and cracks down with hearings and investigations when the president is with the opposition. Congress presents a range of viewpoints on national questions when it holds public hearings, exercises oversights, and engages in debate. It also handles agenda setting, deciding what issues will come up for debate and consideration. The conflict resolution function, Congress acts as an institution to resolve conflicts within American society, brokering between opposing viewpoints or resources. The Constitution is both specific and vague about the powers that Congress may exercise. The Constitution depicts most of the enumerated powers given to Congress. Those powers include establishing and or regulating taxing and spending, borrowing and coining, interstate commerce and foreign trade, military, federal courts, any number of issues. And of these, most important are the power to tax, spend, and regulate commerce, as well as the power to declare war. The Senate alone must advise on and consent to the ratification of treaties. It also must accept or reject presidential nominees such as Supreme Court justices and federal judges and ambassadors. Congress has been awarded additional powers through various amendments to the Constitution. For example, they're able to certify presidential election, determine the acting president or vice president in case of death or incapacitation, or levy an income tax. Under the Necessary and Proper Clause, Congress has the right to make all laws which are necessary and proper to carry out powers in Article 1 and all other powers vested in the Constitution. Its vague wording has greatly expanded the powers of Congress and therefore the national government. Congress is composed of two different but equally important chambers, the House of Representatives and the Senate. You can see the most noticeable difference between the two houses is size. The House has 435 members, Senate has 100. Being larger, the House has more formal rules. particularly regarding floor debate. However, the House has stricter time limits than the Senate, so it can pass legislation more quickly. Another difference involves pace. The Senate's tradition of extended debate on all issues is taken to the extreme in the filibuster, and that's a virtually unlimited discussion and delay to block bills. We saw an increased use of the filibuster that in the past decade have been invoked for nearly every major piece of legislation. That's creating a new ad hoc role that 60 senators are required for every important vote. And some senators, as you might figure, believe the filibuster should be abolished. A big issue in the 2000 elections was whether the Democrats could elect enough senators to make the 60-vote filibuster majority. This would not be possible immediately, so they turned to an anti-filibuster tactic and employed reconciliation rules that do not permit filibusters on budget bills. And finally, a third difference between the houses involves prestige. Due to their longer terms and smaller numbers, senators can achieve a level of personal recognition and media exposure that is almost impossible for members of the House. Who makes up Congress? Generally, members of Congress are older, better educated, higher salaried, and wealthier than the general public. For instance, half are millionaires, and lawyers greatly outnumber all other occupations. Take a few moments when you have time to review the characteristics of the 112th Congress, which bear out those previous numbers. Elections for Congress are decentralized. They're conducted by state governments, but they do conform to stipulations of the U.S. Constitution. Representatives are elected every 2 years, and each state has at least one representative with the number based on census. Senators serve 6-year terms with about 1/3 up for election every 2 years, and each state has 2 senators. Congressional candidates can either be self-selected or recruited by the local political party. Parties usually select a House candidate with social characteristics similar to the district and with past successes in politics. The importance and amount of congressional fundraising has increased in the past 20 years. Even under the restrictions of campaign finance laws, victorious candidates for the Senate now spend an average of $7.5 million on a campaign, while successful House candidates average about $1.4 million. That means almost every day in office can involve some type of fundraising for the next election. In presidential effects, strong presidential candidates have historically allowed congressional candidates on the same ticket to ride their coattails, but this coattail effect has been modest or non-existent in recent years. Incumbents have a huge advantage in congressional elections. There have been dramatic re-election rates of House and Senate members, with over 90% for the former in the past 20 years. A major reason is their ongoing pursuit of re-election, including free publicity, constant media attention, personal appearances, newsletters, and reliance on their service to constituents. Again, here's a chart that outlines the power of incumbency. Apportionment involves several concepts. Reapportionment is the allocation of seats in the House to each state after each census. Redistricting is the redrawing of congressional district boundaries within each state. An issue related to the district boundaries is gerrymandering, and that's the practice dating back to 1812 of drawing lines to favor one party over the other. In 1986, the Supreme Court ruled for the first time that redistricting for political purposes could be challenged as unconstitutional, though in that particular case it could not prove that lines were drawn unfairly. Today, gerrymandering is usually limited to small groups within state legislatures. Two techniques are packing the other party's supporters into as few districts as possible, or cracking them among districts in numbers too small to affect an election. These tactics almost always benefit incumbents. To combat past discrimination and uphold the Voting Rights Act, states were instructed to create congressional districts after the 1990 census that gave more power to minority groups so that minorities were actually a majority. These minority-majority districts were challenged in the courts as being based on race and ethnicity alone. The Supreme Court has ruled both ways on this issue, but most recently in 2001, it reversed itself regarding an oddly narrow strip of land in North Carolina, allowing this district to stand since it could not be proven that race was the main factor in its creation. Legislators have many special benefits. One is franking, the use of their signature instead of a postage stamp to allow for free mailings. Congressional offices, grown dramatically since the 1960s, with employees now totaling about 15,000. Average House office has about 15 staff members, but the average Senate office has 30, and some have double that. And finally, members of Congress get special constitutional protection from the speech or debate clause in the Constitution. It allows that they cannot be sued for libel or slander based on statements made during official duties. Congress gets most of its work done in committees and subcommittees, allowing for specialization and division of labor in reviewing thousands of bills. Congressional committees are often called little legislatures. They're trusted with the expert review and final say over pieces of legislation. They are only rarely deprived of control over bills they have guided through the system, though a procedure for doing so, known as the discharge petition, does exist. Let's now take a look at some of the several types of congressional committees. Permanent committees established in each chamber and operating from session to session are the most important because all bills are referred to them. These are standing committees. Some examples: appropriations committees in both chambers, Ways and Means Committee in the House. Committees organized to handle a particular task within a limited time are called select committees. They're usually not permanent, though some can live forever. An example of that, Select Committee on Intelligence in each chamber. Here's a chart with the standing committees of the 112th Congress. Another type, joint committees. Committees containing members of each chamber working concurrently on a particular task are called joint committees. Special joint committees convene to agree on the exact wording of legislation when separate proposals have been passed are called conference committees. And finally, the House Rules Committee. Since the 1880s, powerful gatekeeper deciding which legislation will reach the floor of the House has been the House Rules Committee. That committee sets limits on debate, determines how a bill will be amended, and convenes while the entire House is meeting so its resolutions can be sent immediately to the floor for consideration.